Hey, this is Jared from PC Gamer. Last year we looked at the performance of the early access version of PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Many patches later, PUBG is past version 1.0 and at least in terms of performance, it's improved plenty. Just don't get me started on the whole loot box thing. So what does it take to run PUBG at a good frame rate? The good news is that the game is mostly GPU agnostic now, meaning you'll get similar performance from AMD and NVIDIA GPUs of the same class. When I tested in March 2017, that definitely wasn't the case. NVIDIA's GTX 1066GB was able to beat every AMD GPU. Granted, Vega wasn't out at the time. Now, things are a lot closer, and the RX 588GB is essentially tied with it. The RX 574GB still falls a bit behind the GTX 1063GB, but at least it's close. The bad news is that compared to other popular multiplayer shooters like Overwatch and Counter-Strike, PUBG is far more taxing. You might be able to get by with a low-end GPU if you dial down the settings and resolution far enough, but if you're hoping for a smooth 1080p at 60 frames per second, you'll need at least GTX 1050 class hardware, preferably GTX 970 or RX 470 and above. For the benchmark sequence, I've used the same location as in my original PUBG testing, running around the outside of a building in Yasnaya Polyana. That will show how things have changed in the past year, but I also wanted to check out the new desert map. It turns out that there's not much difference in performance between the two maps. I'll include results for the desert map on one GPU in the charts as a reference point, but it's basically margin of error differences. Getting into the benchmarks, at 1080p medium as well as lower quality settings, NVIDIA's budget offerings do hold a clear lead over their AMD equivalents. The GTX 1050, for example, breaks 60 frames per second, and the 1050 Ti improves on that by another 10%, while the RX 560, even with 4GB VRAM, only gets about 45 frames per second. All the mid-range cards easily clear 60 FPS, while the 144 FPS frame rate cap starts to come into play on the faster GPUs. I've also included some tests on Intel's HD Graphics 630, the integrated graphics found in the 7th and 8th generation Intel processors. It's about 20 to 30% faster than the 4th generation HD 4600, so if you're using an older notebook and running off integrated graphics, you're going to have a rough go of things. 720p at minimum quality does end up moderately playable on Intel's HD 630, but even a $100 graphics card will basically quadruple or more that level of performance. Moving to maximum quality at 1080p drops performance by about 40% relative to medium quality. AMD's Vega 56 places just ahead of the GTX 1070, while NVIDIA's GTX 1060 cards just edge out the RX 580 and 570. That goes for both the average and minimum frame rates, so there are no serious problems on these cards. Compared to my previous testing, most GPUs are now running about 20 to 30% faster. If you've ever felt like PUBG performance hasn't changed much during the past year, that's likely because it was slow and steady progress rather than one big leap, but it's definitely running better now. Unfortunately, GPU prices are a bit of a mess at present thanks to cryptocurrency miners, but once things settle down again, all the mainstream cards become viable. At the high end, NVIDIA still wins out with the 1080 beating the Vega cards by around 15%, while the 1070 Ti is right around the level of the Vega 64. 1440p Ultra will obviously require a potent card, and the GTX 1070 and above all manage to break 60 FPS, with the two Vega cards sitting in between the GTX 1070 and 1080. That's another solid improvement over last year, where only the 1080 and above managed to break 60 FPS. Frame rate fluctuations vary between the cards, but most of that is just the nature of the engine. The proximity of other players can certainly affect performance, though I tried to avoid running benchmarks unless I was basically alone. If you're hoping to push the limits of a 1440p 144Hz display, about the only way you might get close is with SLI, or a $3,000 Titan V. That's a bit nuts, of course, so you're better off lowering your expectations a bit. 70 to 80 FPS is a great target for most of us, and the mainstream cards like the 1060 and 570 should also be able to handle 1440p, provided you reduce some of the settings to medium or high quality. Medium will boost performance by about 75% compared to ultra quality, and without degrading the experience too much. What about running 4K Ultra? A pair of 1080 or 1080 Ti cards should work, but usually minimum frame rates get worse with SLI. A single, modestly overclocked Titan V will also handle 4K quite nicely, or a more aggressively overclocked 1080 Ti will do the trick. More likely, you'll want to lower the quality settings to get good 4K frame rates. 4K also requires more VRAM to stay viable, but anyone even thinking about 4K should have at least 4GB VRAM, so it shouldn't be too hard to tune the settings. You'll need to run at low to medium quality on the GTX 1070 and Vega cards to get 60 frames per second, however. I've also done some CPU testing with 4-core and 6-core Intel Coffee Lake CPUs and 4-core to 8-core AMD Ryzen processors. I have additional CPU testing resolutions in the main article on PCGamer.com, but for the most part, all the CPUs perform fine. I'm using a GTX 1080 Ti to help push the bottleneck over to the CPU as much as possible, and even then, there's not a whole lot of difference between the 4-core 4-thread and 6-core 12-thread or even 8-core 16-thread parts. What's interesting is that Intel's i3-8100 running at just 3.6 GHz still beats all the Ryzen processors, even when some of those are running more cores at higher clock speeds. There's also surprisingly little difference between the i3-8100 and a higher clocked i7-8700K. The lack of scaling with core count isn't particularly shocking, but to see such little variation with core count and clock speeds is a bit unusual, though of course the 144 FPS cap comes into play at lower settings. Flipping over to some notebook testing, the GTX 1080, 1070, and 1060 mobile variants are all slightly slower than their desktop equivalents. That means that the 1060 notebook falls just below 60 FPS at 1080p Ultra. Testing at higher resolutions would require a different notebook or using an external display, so I didn't go beyond 1080p. What's nice to see is that even though the notebook GPUs are slower, it's a relatively small gap of only 10 to 15%. At lower quality settings, the CPU can also become a bottleneck, but Nvidia's 10 series notebook GPUs, not the QMax versions mind you, are very close to desktop performance levels. One thing I do want to mention is that while PUBG is installed to a Samsung 850 Pro SSD for the desktops, due to the limited storage capacity on the laptop SSDs, I opted to use their hard drive storage. Let's just say that there's a massive difference in some of the stuttering and popping that I see in the game, particularly during the initial airdrop into the level where everything is far worse with a hard drive. If you're experiencing a lot of intermittent stuttering in PUBG, I highly recommend upgrading to a large SSD. Thanks to MSI, who provided all of the primary hardware used for these tests. MSI partnered with us to produce these gaming performance analysis articles and videos, but beyond the hardware, all of the testing is conducted by PC Gamer. The motherboards for the AMD and Intel platforms are the X370 and Z370 Gaming Pro Carbon, equipped with 16GB of high-end G-Skill DDR4 3200 CL14 memory. The graphics cards consist mostly of MSI's Gaming X series, but the RX Vega cards are reference models, while the RX 560 is an Aero. Additional details on the hardware and testing methodology are available in the full article on PCGamer.com. I also dig into more detail on the various settings and how much each affects performance, which will help if you're looking for information on how to best tune your settings. I've stuck with 1080p medium quality as the baseline result, though you can improve performance by about 50% if you drop everything to minimum quality. For higher quality testing, I've stuck with the Ultra setting at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. You can potentially gain a tactical advantage at lower quality settings, though the drop in visual fidelity may hinder rather than help in some cases. Regardless, you'll want to keep your view distance at maximum if possible. Something else to consider is the potential for frame rate fluctuations to detract from the overall experience. For benchmarking purposes, I've left VSync off, but some will prefer a steady 60 frames per second or even 30 FPS instead of seeing swings between 80 and 50 frames per second. Tearing is also a concern if VSync is off, though if you have a G-Sync or FreeSync display, this is less of a problem. Now that Battlegrounds is out of early access, we likely won't see massive upgrades in performance. The game now runs well on a large variety of hardware, and it offers plenty of settings to tweak. Now if only the developers would see fit to remove that frame rate cap, we'd be in business. Thanks for watching, and enjoy those chicken dinners.